Hi, everyone. Welcome to the theater info session. My name is Rachel Milton, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the program officers in NYFA's Grants and Awards Department. This presentation is an info session for the New York City Women's Fund Theater category. The New York City Women's Fund is a signature initiative that addresses the underrepresentation of women in the entertainment industry. The fund provides grants to encourage and support the creation of content that reflects the voices and perspectives of all who identify as women. Okay, so for today's agenda, we'll start off by reviewing what the theater category is. We'll discuss eligibility criteria, how to apply, review the application form, go through the evaluation and selection process, and then finally we'll have a Q&A. If you have questions, please leave them in the Q&A function. And also, applications close Wednesday, November 1st at 11:59 p.m. Okay, so the fund provides grants to encourage and support the content that reflects the creation of content that reflects the voices and perspectives of all who identify as women. Projects must be original play or a book or of a musical with dialogue, lyrics, and music that has not previously been produced. The maximum potential grant for the theater category is $50,000. Projects must include or feature any of the following: a prominent woman-identified perspective, a meaningful woman-identified producer credit, a meaningful woman-identified writing credit, and/or a woman-identified protagonist. It must be an original play or book of music that has not previously been produced. You must be able to project a professional staging, including paid cast and crew, of the developed work by March 31st, 2025 for a minimum of 5 performances in New York City. The project must also be rehearsed and performed in New York City. Production can either be presented to an in-person live audience, an online live audience, or a hybrid of both. The applicant must reside in one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Companies may be incorporated elsewhere, but must have a New York City business address. Applicants can be theater companies, commercial or nonprofit producers, or playwrights planning to self-produce. Funds must be used to complete the project outlined in the application form. Funds may be allocated as the applicant needs to complete the project. However, funds cannot be used to purchase capital goods. So here's a quick guide on how to apply. You'll start by creating a free submittable account, and then you'll begin the online application. In order to access the application, you have to complete an eligibility form. Then you can fill out the online application, and as a note, there are no hard copies that will be accepted. And then finally, you submit your application and receive email confirmation. Here's a brief overview of what the application form looks like. You'll first enter basic information like your name, your address, email, phone number, and contact information. Then you'll add the project name and show running time. You'll share if it's online, live, or hybrid. You'll share a project synopsis. There's a question that asks how your project has a woman-identified perspective that you'll answer. The production schedule and plans need to be listed, as well as promotion and distribution plans, artist bios, and optional letters of intent. And then you'll upload your work sample. And finally, you'll upload your budget and a budget narrative that answers the question, how do you plan to use the NYC Women's Fund to complete your project? As far as work samples, you have to submit a 15-page excerpt of the script to be produced. For musicals, operas, or other productions which music plays a critical role, you can also upload an audio sample that's a maximum of 10 minutes. For devised and company created pieces, a 15-page sample of the previous project and complete description of the prompts or concepts for new work to be created are also accepted. All applicants are required to submit an overall budget. You can use the provided template or upload your own budget. And this is an image of where you can see it in the application. And this is just a picture that shows what the budget looks like once you access it in the application. NYFA requires that all grant applicants complete a demographic questionnaire located at the bottom of the grant application. The answers to these questions will not impact the applicant's review by the selection panel. The questions all remain anonymous. And finally, you can always select prefer not to say when you're responding to a question. NYFA is committed to supporting artists from all backgrounds and all stages in their creative careers. We strongly encourage all artists of color, LGBTQ+ artists, and artists with disabilities to apply. If you want to request an accommodation or if you need assistance in applying, you can contact us directly at NYC Women's Fund at NYFA.org or give us a call at 212-366-6900 extension 213. We just ask that requests for accommodations be made as soon as possible, preferably no later than October 11th. Applications can only be submitted in one category with one project. This is a project-based grant. This fund is a finishing grant. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Okay, so as far as evaluation and selection process, all applications are peer reviewed by selection panels comprised of discipline-specific industry professionals. All applications are reviewed by the respective panels. The panelists change from year to year per different categories. Applications are reviewed over multiple elimination rounds. All applications are checked by NYFA staff for eligibility. Eligible applications are scored by peer review panels based on the following criteria: creativity and artistic merit, prominent women's perspective, and project feasibility. Final grant award amounts are determined by the selection panels. And now, before we start the Q&A, we're going to move on to a section where we talk to a previous grantee. Give me 1 second and I will add them to the conversation. Hi, Dina, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, and thank you for having me.
So I don't know, would you like to start with just like a quick introduction of yourself? I know we have like a slide that shares some information, but I want to give you the space if you have anything you want to share.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Dina Agusti, as it says on the slide. I'm a queer Indonesian Muslim poet, playwright, filmmaker, producer, and activist that's born and raised in Queens, New York City. The project that I worked on was called First Sight, a queer Indonesian love story, which we can get into a little bit more, but it kind of just details how the Suharto regime affected 2 generations of queer Indonesian women and how that dictatorship affected kind of how queerness broke out in Queens, New York City in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Thank you for sharing that. And the next slide has a little bit of information about First Sight, a queer Indonesian love story, but I know you just shared some information, so I'll just leave that up. But yeah, we can just jump into some of the questions that I have for you. Can you tell us what inspired you to apply for this grant?
I think one of the main things that inspired me to apply for this grant was kind of the ability to pay performers and using grants to pay um, cast and crew. I think oftentimes, especially in theater, a good portion of theater grants usually kind of center around more of the project budget or more so the project itself in terms of paying for like kind of the actual props and set, paying for fireproofing, things that are more so not in regards to kind of how people were paid. And I think that was very integral to me. And I think also because this was a finishing grant in particular, in that this was not a development grant where I had to kind of start from the beginning. I could already still be in the middle of a project or development project and I already had something ready. And that kind of just gave me the opportunity to like leverage this story and leverage the story about queer Indonesian women, which oftentimes was not centered in theater, while also being able to have funding to cover for artists as well as being able to work on a project still and be in the middle of the project and not feel like I have to start over in order for me to just get some form of funding in theater.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Okay, so my next question is, the Women's Fund has a competitive application process. Can you share some insights into your application or anything that you think made your proposal stand out?
I think there were several factors, especially given the fact that I applied as an individual artist. I did not at the moment at the time did not apply with a production company in regards to it. I think one of the first things was I was just very specific in terms of what the play was about, who this centered specifically, and kind of highlighting the intersections not only of womanhood but also other identities. Where for this play, it was a docu-theater play that was based on a culmination of interviews with two generations of queer Indonesian women, how the dictatorship affected them, how the lesbian Z movement in Indonesia kind of migrated to Queens, New York City. And I think I tried to hone in on that as much as possible and stay true to the story. I think the other aspect of it was highlighting that even if, let's say, I did not get this grant, there was still an emphasis that there was a plan that was laid out in terms of how this was going to be funded, how um, the project was going to be supported, because there were I already had inquiries sent out to different theaters. And at the time for me, this play was premiered at NYC Festival at Connolly Theater. But before even knowing that it was going to happen there were already inquiries for other theaters in order for this play to happen. And also, there was still a little bit of funding in that there was a small $500 commission grant, and there was also a little bit of crowdfunding that was already available. So there was still a budget that was there as well. And I think the culmination of those things kind of emphasized that the purpose of the Women's Fund was to make this a finishing grant, and that it would help complete the project rather than kind of starting it from the ground up in a sense. So I think it was really just specificity in regards to the actual description of my project, as well as kind of showing proof and support that it was still going to happen in by 2024.
Yeah, totally. I think it's very key to remember when doing this application that these are finishing funds. So like really kind of harping on the fact that you're already at a place with your project where you're just looking for that final push to get things finished. My next question for you is, do you have or did you have any big challenges during the project?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges was being mindful of just contingencies and also just last minute forms of funding or last minute calls for funding. I think for me, when I set out my budget plan, I did have a section of just kind of a section for like just contingency funds in case like we needed sudden expenses. And that did end up happening in regards to for this play in particular, because it was at Connolly Theater. Connolly Theater has a very specific fireproofing plan, and all the props and set needed to be fireproof, which was not something I allocated in the budget when I applied. But luckily, there was because of kind of that leeway of funding, we were able to get that covered and get our props and set fireproofed. So that was kind of one of the biggest challenges. And also, the other aspect was having another cast member having to be added, just due to kind of how the play ended up being rewritten, as well as kind of like the festival requirements. We ended up having an additional cast member, which also added an additional expense. So I think that was something that I had to allocate for last minute. So that, yeah, allocate for last minute, but also it's something that even if you don't know for sure what additional expenses you may need, they're probably going to come up at some point.
Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing that. And then do you have any like big takeaways from this process?
I think the biggest takeaway for me was kind of the emphasis of specificity, and how much that was kind of integral to getting funding, not only for this and getting support for this project, but also kind of generally garnering support for it, even when it came to the actual turnout of the play and the process and ticket sales and all of that jazz. I think I used to think prior to applying for NYFA that I had to be very vague or as broad as possible in order to make my project seem relatable or to make my work seem as relatable as possible. So I was very general and I talked about my work in very, very, very broad strokes. So I would just kind of say, oh, this is kind of just about like women empowerment, but never really emphasizing what exactly. And I think receiving the grant as well as kind of going through the actual process of it and like specifying what I needed kind of helped me hone in on it is important to focus on that specificity and not worry about being as universal as possible. The specificity, the universality is going to be in the specific. Um, and I think that helped me kind of hone in on just like not only the application process, but just describing my work overall.
Yeah, totally. I think it's really important to be as specific as possible because you want to show what makes your project unique, and you did a really good job of that in your application. And then my final question for you is just, do you have any final advice for the applicants?
I think my final advice for applicants outside of kind of just being as specific as possible is trying to really push and explain as much as this is going to be a grant about why you need funding. I think it is just really important to show why you care about this project, why you want this project to kind of come into fruition, and why do you want it now in particular. I think oftentimes there is a thing where there is like, of course, like it's obvious that artists want to have their art out there and they want their art like produced out in the world. At the same time, like there, I think whether it's an application process, but also kind of just in general, like really interrogate why now? What about it is important for it now? Why can't it wait until the next year or the year after? What is it about this time and in this place and in this moment where it feels right for this project to come to fruition and have that kind of affect how you apply? Um, and also like note the like urgency, not necessarily urgency in that like it has to be something that is tragic, but urgency in the sense of, well, why does this need to be out in the world right now? And kind of framing your description based on that is very helpful.
Yeah, that's really good advice about the urgency of a project. Thank you for that. And then I guess we can open it up to any final questions for Dina. If you have anything that you want to ask them specifically, you can share it in the Q&A function right now. There is a question that says, can you share tips on how to approach the budget and production team for this proposal? Do you have any tips that you can share about that?
Yeah, for sure. I think what I would suggest in regards to how to approach a budget is one, just emphasize and be very specific on what you are looking to pay for. So if you are trying to emphasize on paying for cast and crew in this grant, or if you're really just looking for funding for artistic materials or a mix of both, how much that would you generally need? Um, so I think like for me, it was a thing where I applied initially for $5,000. And I think for me, how I split it was that half of it went to payment for cast and crew. And then like generally for half, it was just for material projects for props and set. And it was a 5-person cast with about a 5-person crew. So that kind of like, if that helps, I kind of gauge like how funding worked for me in regards to it. So I think like try to consider just how much specific you're going to in terms of total budget. I think also don't be afraid to Google things. So, or like that's very obvious, but like if let's say, for instance, when it comes to like props and like set, if you are looking hypothetically at a couch, consider moving budget as well. So like, okay, if let's say hypothetically you are buying a couch from IKEA, like how much would that generally cost if that is kind of like your last resort in terms of purchasing things? Although like you do also get access to material for the arts through this grant, so also kind of keep that in mind. Um, but also consider kind of moving budget. So like have a general quote or look up a general quote of if let's say you need to transport items from one location to the theater, especially if it's self-produced, how much would that cost? And include that in the budget as well. Um, and then also kind of for payment, like kind of just consider a little bit of like how much for, I guess when it comes to payment for everyone, kind of consider like how many hours generally they are going to be working and then how many performance days they are and kind of gauge it based on that. and then add a little bit more money, maybe about like $300, generally just again for miscellaneous funds.
And then there was another question that asked, was your budget amount the amount that you received for your project?
I ended up getting a little bit more. I think I ended up getting a little bit more. I ended up receiving, instead of 5,000, I ended up getting 5,500. So I ended up getting a little bit more than I anticipated.
And there's another question that just asked, well, they say, thank you so much for speaking with us first. And then they ask if your play had any previous readings or developmental workshops.
Yes, it did have a couple of developmental workshops. So I had one with Lime Arts, I think a couple of months prior to the application, I think 2 months before. And then with Lime Arts Productions, and then it had another one in 2021 at the Tank, and then it had another one at Rogue Theater Festival that same year.
Another question asked, did you have any other resources that were added to the grant, or did you produce the project with just the funding from NYFA and MOME?
That's a great question. It was in conjunction with other grants. It was a thing where when applying for it, I already had a commission grant from Lime Arts Theater, about $500, and there was already crowdfunding into the budget. But then it was also a thing where after receiving the budget, I ended up applying for a couple of additional grants. One was from the Bechtel project, which was just a rehearsal grant, or that provides you basically grant money for space. And Next Doc, which is a fellowship program I'm already under, provided a $1,500 grant. So yeah, it was in conjunction with other grants.
Cool. And do we have any final questions for Dina? I don't see anything else specific in the chat, but I just wanted to give the space if anybody else had any final questions. There is a question that I think is for you. It's not specified, but they ask, how do you know how much to apply for? Was it a percentage of the total budget, or was it need specific?
How I determined it was basically more so need specific. So it was a thing where I applied based on kind of generally, and part of it was from previous iterations or experience with like previous self productions and kind of gauging how much those cost. And kind of gauging the rates based on that. So it was more so just like instead of kind of going into it like, okay, I need like 30% more of this budget, it was more so, okay, I need more funding, or just funding in general, for materials for props and set, and payment for cast and crew. And that was kind of like the main things that I focused on, as well as just a little bit of a budget for potentially needing performance space and like rentals for rehearsal space. And I think gauging it based on, let's say if it's like, I know like a 5, if you need to have a minimum performance of like 5 performance dates, but then like you need maybe like 120 hours of rehearsal time total in the course of like several months. Kind of generally, what can you pay per hour, and then kind of combining that was kind of how I gauged it overall in terms of like for payments for folks. And then when it came to kind of just like materials and set, it was just more so generally, well, based on the script, what is needed, what is necessary. Okay, there's a couch, there's a side table that's necessary, a bookshelf is necessary. Generally, how much would that cost, as well as transporting it for how many nights. And then kind of just like looking up a quote from like U-Haul or like a prominent like moving company that I anticipated using for it if there was no storage space in the theater.
There's a couple more questions for you. Someone is asking, how did you respond to the question, who is your target audience and how will you reach them?
Oh, that's great. For me, I was very specific in terms of how, like, especially basically it was a thing for me where when it came to that question, I just specified who I wrote this for. I was very transparent about who I wrote this for and who was the primary audience. which in this case, it was Southeast Asian, particularly queer Indonesian women. And then also is a thing where I, especially as someone who was born and raised in Queens, New York City, and kind of being involved in the like Indonesian community for a very long time, and also just like the Southeast Asian artist space for a long time, I kind of just went into and delved into how those connections were made. So part of it was emphasizing, hey, I kind of grew up in Elmhurst and Woodside, and I'm already kind of connected to, in my case, being Muslim, the local like mosque over there, and then also emphasizing other organizations or communities I've been a part of throughout my artist career. So focusing on either fellowships I've gone where I've built those connections, previous iterations of productions where are the artists that were associated with those through like my previous work, and kind of, yeah, delving into that.
Okay, someone is asking, did your show finish its run already? If not, when or where can we see it?
It did finish its run. It was at NYC Connolly Theater. At the end of July, there was a there were 2 live performances, and then there were 4 live stream performances in August.
Someone is asking, did you budget to pay yourself as well?
Yes, I like put about basically around the same amount as the crew. I allocated a little bit just to pay for myself, not only because of kind of just working as a playwright, but also because I knew as kind of self-producing it, I was going to be producing this like to a certain degree, and also like it does take a lot of labor, so it is helpful that you get paid to a certain degree in this as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's really important for artists to pay themselves and their budgets. There's a question that's asking that you mentioned an entity that supports rehearsal and support or rehearsal time and space. Can you share what the name of that was?
It is the Bechtel project. So it's BECHDEL project. Basically, they kind of have their own studio. And I don't remember where on the website, but if you look into the website, they basically have a form where you can explain what your project is, what you would need the space for. And they will allocate basically either a grant or their actual studio space for a certain allotted amount of time.
And then there's another question that asks, did you follow AEA payment guidelines for actors?
To a certain degree, yes. I think yes and no. In that, like for me, I went if it was a thing where basically like I went by non-union, or all the actors were non-union, but we still kind of just followed the general payment, or I just followed the general payment guidelines when it came to it in terms of just the amount or like the total stipend. But not necessarily the full AEA guidelines, but that's also because there was an emphasis on, especially for this festival, in order to have the number of performances, I could not use union actors.
Okay, and I think that's all the questions that people have for you. Dina's website and Instagram and Twitter are listed here if y'all would like to follow them and keep up with their projects. But thank you so much for joining us. This was super helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again. Okay, and now we'll move into the Q&A portion. I'm going to go through from the top and answer some of the original questions that have come in, but please feel free to keep sharing or adding questions into the Q&A. One question asked, if they're producing a cast album for a musical, would they apply here or would they apply under music? You would apply under the music option, or the music category rather. There's a question that asks if this presentation will be shared, and yes, it'll be available on NYFA's YouTube. It'll also be accessible on the website. There's a question that asks what it means that this is for finishing grants. These are grants that support projects that are like near completion. So specifically with theater projects, you already are at a place where you're just looking for the funding. So like your project is already written and like ready to go. You're just looking for like the funding to get over the finish line. In the other categories, such as the film and media categories, the finishing grant would basically means that you've completed production and now you're just moving into post-production. Someone's asking what capital goods means, and that means just equipment, essentially. So anything that like you'd be purchasing as far as like a camera to record the show or laptops to work on, that's something that you wouldn't be eligible to spend the grant on. Someone says, how do you know how much you need to apply for? Is it a percentage of a total budget or need specific? I think honestly, you can only answer that question about how much you're requesting and what you think is your need. You should be specific about like why you're applying and like what the need is in your budget. You can also like list specifically what you're looking for from NYFA. There's a question that asks, what is the average grant amount per theater project? This varies from project to project because the panelists have the final say in what each grant recipient receives. So I don't really have like an average to share with you. There's a question that says, do you discourage asking for a large budget? Again, no, this really depends on just what your need is. And I would just suggest you just ask for whatever your need is. There's a question that asks, do the artist, writer, and director who would be the base of the project need to be residing in New York City? The recipient of the funds has to be local to New York City and live in one of the 5 boroughs. But if the recipient or like the applicant in this case isn't the director, it would be fine for them to not live in New York City. There's a question that says, can I produce this production prior to the grant award and still qualify? No, because the funds cannot be applied retroactively. So production would have to start after you receive the funds. There's a question that asks, can you get the grant but for a lesser amount than you requested? Yes, you can receive a lesser amount than you originally requested. And again, the panelists decide the final numbers of what each recipient receives. There's a question asking, does this grant count as earned income? Yes, and you will receive tax information. That's one of the reasons why you have to have an EIN number or a social security number in order to apply. There's a question asking how many people organizations are awarded in theater in any given year. This also varies from year to year. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but you can look on the NYFA website in the theater category and see the previous awardees from each year. It really does vary depending on how many people apply and like what the panelists are able to do as far as the allocation of funding. Someone asked, do you need to create a new submittable account if you already have one? No, you should be able to just log into your original submittable account and still access our application. Someone says, Dina mentioned that their play had previous workshops readings, just double checking that a developmental reading does not count as a previous production. Yeah, a reading would not count as a previous production. We're specifically talking about like a big production of your project. So a workshop would be fine. There's a question that says, when I read up to $50,000 was available, I thought that I should ask for that amount, but Dina's request amount was quite modest. Does amount requested figure into how your project is evaluated? No, we don't ask panelists to like award someone just because they ask for a very small amount. We really do it, they really do like determine it based on your need and what you're asking for. But I also would say not to just ask for 50,000 just because that's the maximum. I would really try to determine like what is your need and like what would be the best amount for you specifically, and not just because the total is 50,000. There's a question that asks, if your project is an opera production, should you apply in the theater category? Yes, you can. There's a question that says, do we need a letter from the theater where we plan to present in order to submit the application? No, the letters of intent are optional. There's a question that asks, would a stage reading be eligible? I believe in the answer to that is no, it would have to be the full production. There's a question that asks, if we haven't secured a director or a cast yet, how should I proceed on the application? You can apply and just in your application specify that you just haven't selected a director or a cast yet. That's totally fine. There's a question that asks, can you apply with fiscal sponsorship and is it recommended? No, you don't have to apply with a fiscal sponsor, and there's like no specific recommendations around it, but if you have one, that's perfectly fine. There's a question that says, can the collaborator be from another country? Yes, they can be. There's a question that is asking about the window the production must run if the grant is received. The production would just have to take place before March, the ending of March in 2025, so a year after you would receive the grant. There's a question asking about the general time frame on when awarded grants are announced. Usually applicants find out in late February if they've received the grant, and then in March, there's the official announcement. There's a question asked, will your application be stronger if attached to an organization or fiscal sponsor? No, there's no like boost to your application if you have a fiscal sponsor or an organization that you're working with. There's another question about fiscal sponsorship, and it asks, can you avoid income tax by asking the funds to be directed to a fiscal sponsor? Yes, your fiscal sponsor can receive the funds for you. There is another question asking, do you have to have a specific theater in mind before submitting the application? No, there's no requirement for that. Someone is asking what constitutes a workshop production for this grant and says that their play was produced for a 5-night run where it was considered a workshop and not a full production, but there were light sets, costumes, etc. You can email me and we'll answer this question offline because I'm honestly not sure on how to answer that. My instinct is telling me that it would still be considered produced, but you can email us at nycwomensfund@nyfa.org and I'll answer that question offline. Someone is asking, if you're applying to make a film, can you send the script that has been developed as a play or does it need to be a video? If you're applying to make a film, you would have to apply within the media category. And in that case, you also would have to already have completed pre-production. So you wouldn't submit a script, you would submit the actual footage from that film. Is it correct that you don't need to have a theater committed to you or your project yet? Yes, that's correct. Someone asked, can costs for casting sessions be included in the budget? Yes, they can be. Someone asked if you can apply more than once for a project within several years. Yes, you can apply, but it has to be one application per cycle. Someone asked if the main actor or director can be changed after we receive the grant. Yes, that's fine. There's a question that asks, can you explain again what finishing grants means? I didn't understand what it means if you're wanting to do a documentary. There's actually an info session that goes over all the details for the documentary category that's available on YouTube. But as far as it being a finishing grant for a media project, you just have to have already completed principal photography. There is a question asking for a theater project, is there a minimum amount of performances suggested? And yes, the requirement is 5. Can rehearsal time be included in the budget? Yes. There's a question asking if you can apply for more than one category. No, you can only apply for one per cycle. There's a question asking if the 10-minute opera video or opera video sample needs to be continuous. No, and it also doesn't have to be a video sample. I believe it can be like an MP4 file. Someone is asking, how do you know how much to apply for? Is it a percentage of the total budget or is it need specific? That is all dependent on you and what you're looking for your budget. There's no like requirement for it to be exactly $50,000. There is a question that asks what kind of theater project generally receive the maximum grant of 50,000. I honestly don't have an answer to that question. It really varies from year to year, and the panelists do make the final decisions on what on who receives the maximum amount. There's a couple of questions that ask about what counts as not being previously produced. And because there's so many, please feel free to just email me directly and I can get more information about what your project has been, how your project has been produced in the past, and if it would still be eligible or not. And again, you can email us at nycwomensfund@nyfa.org. Is a new translation or adaptation of a foreign play eligible? The play has never been produced in English. No, it has to be a new project. It can't just be an adaptation of a foreign language play. Is it preferable to apply as a self-producing playwright or through a not-for-profit 501c3 if both are options? There's no specifics around if it's like I guess more like eligible if you apply as a playwright or through a non-for-profit. Both have been awarded before. It's really up to you how you want to apply. There's a question that asks, will the panelists be announced? The panelists aren't announced until after the recipients are announced. So they will be announced, but not until March of next year. There's a question that says, I would like to submit an audio sample or a video sample of my theater work, but the application says audio only. Can I send an MP4 video or will that disqualify my application? No, you cannot send video. You would have to send a manuscript of the project that you're planning to produce, and it would disqualify your application if you submitted an MP4 video. Someone asked, can the minimum of 5 performances be done in different theaters? Yes, that's fine. Someone asked about Dina's performances and if they were performed twice and offered live streaming 3 times. Yes, you can choose to do online, or there's like the option of choosing like online or in person. And when you're on your application and like applying, you can select hybrid if you want to do both. Can the producer live in New York City, but the writer and director live upstate? If the producer is the applicant and would be the recipient of the funds, yes, that would work. There is a question that asks, is it acceptable to allocate union incurred expenses in our proposed budget? And yes. There's a question asking, does the grant fund workshop productions as opposed to full productions? No. There is a question that asks about the accepted genders of producers and if it could be a man. Yes, a producer can be a man. I'll scroll back up to the eligibility slide that addresses some of those questions as well, just so you can have it for reference. And again, projects just must feature or include any of the following. So a prominent woman identified perspective, a meaningful woman identified producer credit, a meaningful woman identified writing credit, and or woman identified protagonist. So it doesn't have to include all of those. It's just, it has to feature at least one of the following listed there. There's a question that asks, does secured funding versus pending funding make a difference in how the project is perceived? Again, questions like this I can't really give an answer to because it's really going to be based on the panelists and what they are inclined to think when you submit your application. I will say that I don't think that there's like it would be like detrimental to your application if you like say that you have secured funding already. If anything, I think that that just shows that you're like working on your project and have already had support, which in my opinion would make it look stronger. But again, I can't answer on behalf of the panelists. There's a question that asks, can the play be in different languages? Yes, there's no issue with different languages being used in the play. There's a question that asks, is the creative content or the specificity of the budget more important to the panelists? Again, I can't answer questions about what the panelists will be like looking for specifically, but I will say that I'll scroll back to the section that talks about what the criteria is for the panelists, and the way that they're listed is in no like specific order. So nothing is like here. The criteria that are listed are not ranked in like order of importance. They're just looking at all 3 of those aspects. There's a couple questions that ask about taxes with your budget and if it's acceptable to include tax in the budget. Yes, that's totally fine. Can a physical theater or contemporary circus without dialogue qualify? Yes, that would be fine. There are a couple of very specific questions, like for example, someone is asking about paying a composer and if their project is far along enough. If you have very specific questions like that, you can email me directly and I can give you an answer via email. So anything one that has like more specific questions about like how determining how far along your project is and stuff like that, you can just email me. There is a question asking, do artists submit solo shows in this category? Yes, there have been submissions of solo shows. There's a question asking if NYFA has certain demographic targets it hopes to hit when awarding funds. No, there's no specific demographic targets. If we secure funding after we've already submitted our application, can we email you updates? Unfortunately, no, only your application will be reviewed by the panelists. There's a question to ask, can production travel for the different performances? The productions have to be based in New York City, so no. And like, of course, you can have outside of like the 5 initial performances, if you have other performances in other cities, that's totally fine. Can renting of space for performances be included in my budget? Yes, you should include that in your budget. That's totally fine. There's a question asking, can one playwright submit an application to self-produce and also be named as a playwright on another application? No, you can only submit with one application per cycle. So if you're a key collaborator on another project, you wouldn't be eligible. There's a question asking about the range of grants dispersed. That really depends on what the lowest, I guess, ask would be per year. And I don't really have an idea of what that is, depending on, what applicants apply with, but it will be a maximum of $50,000. If my show was self-produced previously, does that count? Yes, it would count as being produced previously. Do a certain number of your members of your team need to identify as women? No, they do not have to have a specific number of team members that identify as women. There is a question asking, can someone be a part of multiple projects, such as a playwright applying for more than one? And no, the answer to that is no, you cannot apply with more than one project. There's actually a question on the eligibility form that asks if you are a key collaborator on other projects. And if you select yes for that, it will lock you out and say that you're ineligible. There's a question asking, is there a maximum of performances that you can have? No, there is no maximum. You can do as many performances as you'd like. There is a question asking if we can view the slides on our own after this meeting. Yes, this webinar will be posted on NYFA's YouTube, and the link will be on the NYFA website later this week. There's a question that asks, if you choose hybrid, so to do in-person and virtual performances, how do you address the minimum of 5 performances? You would just select how many in person you would want to do and how many virtual you would want to do. Also, when you get to that point, you can talk to NYFA staff, and we'll also discuss with MOME, like if there's like a specific around, if you want to have like multiple performances like outside of that, you can, as far as like your public access component, you can ask us for more details and we'll work with you to determine what that would be. Can you include additional info as far as international tours in addition to New York productions? Yes, you can include that information. There's a question that asks, if you submit an audio sample and manuscript, should the manuscript be the same excerpt as the audio sample, or do you recommend using different parts of the work? There's no requirement that it has to be the same. You can choose whatever you feel most comfortable with when you submit your work samples. There's a question that asks, if the objective is to have the performances available on YouTube for free, is that acceptable for a possible grant? Yes, and that would also fulfill the public access component that's required of each applicant or each recipient. So having it like eventually available to be viewed for free would be great. There are some additional questions that are a little bit more specific in the Q&A function right now. And we have to wrap up because we've reached an hour with this webinar. But please, if you have additional questions, you can email me at nycwomensfund@nyfa.org. You can reach out to me directly. My name is Rachel. And if you have additional questions, you can also check the NYFA website. There's a frequently asked questions section that has a lot of the answers to these questions as well. But again, if you have more specific questions, you can reach out to me directly. Thank you again for joining.